everyone who watches all the videos on my channel have recently seen the next two books that I'll be posting reviews of, including this one, because I talked about them both in my academic book haul. This first one is about, but not by, but just about a thinker that I've always wanted to read but have never had the chance. And that thinker is Reinhold Niebuhr. And this book is called Why Niebuhr Matters by Charles Lemert. For several years now, I've had Niebuhr's Moral Man and Immoral Society and his book, The Nature and Destiny of Man, by far his two most best-known books, resting on my bookshelf, but never felt it really urgent enough to read them anytime soon. In some ways, Charles Lemert's book about the elder Niebuhr brother changed this. The book's main strength is Lemert's hagiographic voice, one that's almost always prepared to mount a passionate and reasoned defense of Niebuhr's views. Its main weaknesses are frequent and somewhat lengthy sort of screeds into political and social issues Niebuhr was never able to address himself because they took place years after his death, and which sort of come off as sanctimonious grandstanding on the part of Lemert. But that's very minor, and the core of the book is actually quite good when he's talking about Niebuhr himself. Niebuhr was born in Missouri in the 1890s, the son of German immigrants. His father was a German evangelical pastor. German evangelicalism was later absorbed into the Church of Christ during Niebuhr's lifetime in the 1950s, 1959, I believe. His origins were pretty austere, but there must have been something really, really special going on in the Niebuhr household, because not only did Reinhold become a leading theologian, ethicist, and public intellectual, his brother Richard taught the history of religion at Yale, and his sister Hulda was a vocal proponent of Christian education and also a professor of divinity at Chicago in a time when women were still rarely afforded the opportunity to attend university, let alone be awarded teaching positions. After attending Yale Divinity School and taking his MA, but never his terminal PhD, Niebuhr took a position as a pastor at a small church in Detroit, where he quickly became enamored with the culturally and economically liberal message of the social gospel, and spoke out against what he thought were the abuses and greed of Henry Ford, who was just up and coming then. Lemert discusses Niebuhr's roots in concepts of social justice, his activism, his ever-patient pastoral care to his parishioners while he was in Detroit, and his eventual move to Union Theological Seminary in New York. While, as we'll see in a moment, Niebuhr soon abandoned his political liberalism, and I'm using the term liberalism here, pretty important because I'll talk about the word and reference it in two different ways. He abandoned the liberalism of economic progressiveness and social egalitarianism in some senses, the way that we usually use it today in common punditry parlance. He abandoned this. Even though he did, his early experiences undoubtedly shaped one of the questions that would continue to pop to the surface in his life's work. And that question is, how can one balance individual liberties and the issues of social justice? And you'll continually see this come up in his books. Niebuhr went to Union Theological Seminary to teach in 1930, where he would remain for a generation, retiring in 1960. Soon after arriving, his avowed Marxism slowly started to change into what we would call today, recognize today, something more of a Christian realism. His earlier liberalism, here understood in a broader sense, basically said and affirmed that humanity's ability to better itself through the application of reason technology, science, and legislation was possible. Whereas Christian realism, the position that Niebuhr took up, posits that societies are corrupt, and here's maybe the more damning part, that people are unwilling to admit that corruption and those deficiencies within society to themselves. And the reason why they're unable to do that is because of sin. Niebuhr thinks of sin not so much as a theologically or ontologically unchanging category, at least not in the sense that it's usually used by more conservative Protestant evangelicals. Rather, he saw it as the inability of people to recognize their own limitations. Probably something even an atheist could get behind, even if they were wary of the word sin itself. Soon after he arrived at Union, Niebuhr published perhaps his most famous book, called Moral Man and Immoral Society, in 1932, which is a really trenchant critique of American liberalism, again, in the broad sense that we can better ourselves through science, technology, law, reason, etc. He says that while individuals are often capable of moral behavior, nation-states and societies rarely are, because their actions are so tied up with various interests which complicate to the point of impossibility real ethical action. Niebuhr courageously takes their ideas to their natural conclusion. He says that national values, sometimes, though not always, expressed by those chest-thumping patriots that you so often see in today's culture, that those people must be corrupt, or that those ideas must be corrupt, because they praise a nation, they praise a society. And remember, societies and nations cannot be good. Moral man in a moral society. This is a really daring suggestion, and one that Niebuhr would maintain throughout his life, which spanned much of the Cold War, certainly a time when such chest-thumping was pretty popular. What was the solution? Was it more church or an increased amount of devotion? According to Niebuhr, it really was neither. His critique of the church is in some ways just as harsh. In Moral Man and Immoral Society, Niebuhr says of the religion and the church that they, quote, encourage love and benevolence by absolutizing the moral principle of life until it achieves the purity of absolute disinterestedness, and by imparting transcendent worth to the life of others. In other words, religion, especially Protestant religion here, I think, Protestant Christianity and the church have a really bad habit of making otherworldly, very worldly concerns. They have a bad habit of transcendentalizing them, allowing us to focus on them less and less. Niebuhr's later book, which was originally a set of Gifford lectures published in 1943 as The Nature and Destiny of Man, is a truly sobering account of human beings and their place in the world, which touches on some of the same issues and more fully develops them. It may be clear why skeptics or even atheists can see something to agree with in the corpus of Niebuhr's thought. There used to be, and there still may be, laying around somewhere, a group that identified themselves as atheists for Niebuhr. Morton White, the American philosopher and historian of ideas, wrote this about them. Quote, those who applaud his politics are too liable to turn to his theory of human nature and praise it as the philosophical instrument of Niebuhr's political agreement with themselves. But very few of those whom I have called atheists for Niebuhr follow this inverted logic to its conclusion. They don't move from praise of Niebuhr's theory of human nature, to praise of its theological ground. We admire them for drawing the line somewhere, but certainly not for their consistency. In a time when the United States is probably the most religious of first world countries, it's more than curious why a figure like Niebuhr would be marginalized as much as he is. It may be because most American Protestant evangelicals are pretty politically conservative, whereas Niebuhr, even the later Niebuhr, was a progressive regarding secular issues. Remember, he fought against Henry Ford, his greed. He was also very politically active, mostly in what we would call today liberal causes, but as I said, he used the word liberal in a bit of a different sense. Or maybe, especially after 9/11, our naive ideas about national innocence and purity are too unquestioned to spark a sincere appreciation for and conversation with a thinker who derided cheap nationalism and patriotism and exceptionalism. But if the United States ever develops something like a left-wing cultural evangelicism, its founders could probably do worse than to look to Reinhold Niebuhr, a thinker whose willingness to criticize both his own intellectual roots and those of his country never weakened by a felt need for conformity or popularization. Lemert's personal polemics that I referred to earlier and grudges sometimes come through in the book. They're very often left-leaning, which is fine, but I'm not sure why they would be in the book. But as I said, those faults are his own and don't reflect really on his writing about Niebuhr himself or Niebuhr's thought itself. And his exposition of Niebuhr, however, made me curious to pick up the two books that I spoke about and finally come to read them for myself. Why Niebuhr Matters by Charles Lemert.